Well, good afternoon and welcome. The Rector of UNSW Canberra, Professor Michael Frater, will welcome you formally to the conference following afternoon tea. My task, though, for now is to set the scene. And I want to do so by answering four questions. First, why is UNSW Canberra hosting this conference, and why is it being held at Old Parliament House? The second question, why hold a series of Howard Government retrospective conferences now? My third question, why does this conference examine the period January of 1997 to July of 2001? And my final question, what were the possibilities and prospects, the challenges and the conflicts facing the coalition at the beginning of its second year in power? Noting, of course, that our first volume and last year's conference looked at the 1996 election and the first year of coalition rule. Well, so to my first question, why UNSW Canberra, why Old Parliament House? Well, in 2014, Mr Howard announced that his official papers would be transferred to the Defence Academy Library managed by UNSW Canberra under a unique agreement with the National Archives of Australia, of which there are representatives and our friends here today. The John Howard collection will be expanding as more and more documents enter the open access period in 2019. Now, this already substantial holding is being developed alongside the Howard Government collection, consisting of personal papers from senior Howard Government ministers that have been separately donated to the university. So far we have the Reith papers, the Ruddock archive, and Tim Fisher's very substantial press clipping collection of 40 plus years. Dr. David Kemp will deposit his papers in December of this year as the collection continues to grow. So this conference is part of a larger effort to promote both record collections and to profile research opportunities for higher degree students and established scholars at UNSW Canberra. There is no point us having this material if it isn't used, and it won't be used unless people know that we have it. So the conference, the book, are all part of that effort. The university too recognises it has a privileged position, and it has an obligation to exercise creative stewardship of these valuable resources. This is the first time that a prime ministerial body of papers has been transferred to an outside body. We're conscious of that. We're conscious of the goodwill of the archives and what we need to do to respond, I think, on our own part. The establishment of the Howard Library alongside the Museum of Australian Democracy within Old Parliament House is intended to maximise public awareness of the material the university is holding and to locate research and writing of the period 1996 to 2007 within the wider conversation about the evolution of Australian democracy. Let me come then to my second question. Well, why now? Why do this now? Well, I think we've entered a transition period. More than 20 years after the coalition was elected to power, and nearly 10 years after its electoral defeat on the 24th of November 2007, the work of assessing the performance of the Howard government has moved from being the task of observers to the responsibility of historians. We are moving, I think, from commentary to analysis. But scholars of the official records need to have the research agenda discussed and defined. So the aim of this conference and the companion volume is to be critical rather than celebratory, although I hope giving praise where it is due, to create an atmosphere of open and balanced inquiry, including among those who contributed to the history we are assessing, while making the most of the passage of time and the fact that some of the dust has begun to settle. Now, the conference booklet contains an inventory produced by my colleague Trish Burgess of the monographs about the Howard government that were published between 1997 and 2001. You'll also find there my overview of contemporary commentary on the first Howard government. I would welcome your comments and criticisms of both the inventory and my appraisal of it. Now, my purpose in drafting this text was twofold. The first was giving the reader a sense of where and why the coalition was commended and criticised between 1997 and 2001, and in fact to alert you to how little was written about the first few years of the Howard government. And that remains true. Most of the commentary is actually of the period 2001 and thereafter. But, and I take much from Paul Kelly's remarks at our conference last year, 1996 was the foundation year, and to understand the certain trajectories that were commenced then helps us, I think, to understand then what follows. The second reason for writing this script that I've put in front of you was simply to observe the "it's too early to tell" tone and the wait and see tenor of much that was written. So people writing at the time were conscious they couldn't see the full significance of what they were attempting to address. Now, it is true, 2 decades on, we are much better placed to assess the coalition's performance and to determine the long-term consequences of its decisions. So this conference seeks to set an agenda for the researchers who will have access to the official records over the next decade. What hasn't been written about, what's been written about poorly, and where should research effort be placed? So the presentations these next 2 days are not intended to be the final word, but in fact thoughtful works in progress. To my third question, why focus on the period January 1997 to July 2001? Well, our Howard Government retrospective project involves 4 conferences and 4 companion volumes. The first conference, as I've mentioned, covered the 1996 election and the first year of coalition rule. It seemed to us that that foundation year, again to quote Paul Kelly, gave us enough for more than a substantial volume. This second conference begins with the Workplace Relations Act that came into effect on the 1st of January 1997 and ends with the Aston by-election on the 14th of July 2001 and what for many was an unexpected coalition victory. It was a period dominated by, I think, industrial relations, expenditure review and plainly taxation reform, and distinct movements in the coalition's electoral fortunes, down then up. Now, in my judgment, the final 20 months of the first Howard government and the first 30 months of the second Howard government are best addressed together. There is a great deal of continuity across that period. And the decision to conclude in July of 2001 meant and means the tumultuous second half of 2001, marked by the collapse of Ansett Airlines, the September 11 terrorist attacks and the subsequent invasion of Afghanistan, the MV Tampa and Children Overboard controversies would be addressed when we examine the third Howard government in 2018 and also the controversial invasion of Iraq. The final conference, to be held in 2019, will start with the October 2004 election campaign and end with an assessment of the coalition's heavy defeat in November of 2007. It, in fact, is the only conference of the 4 that will assess 2 elections. So let me come to my final question. In my judgment, what were the possibilities and prospects, the challenges and the conflicts the coalition was facing at the end of 1996? Well, every first-term government begins with high hopes. Those exercising political power are determined to avoid the mistakes of those they succeed. Those who voted for the victorious party expect beneficial policy reforms. Those who voted for the previous administration hope for magnanimity. When claiming victory for the coalition on the night of the 2nd of March 1996, John Howard assured Australians that, and I quote, "The government that I will lead will be a government not only for the people who voted for us, but also for the people who voted against us." Also for the people who voted against us. He went on to say that uniting the Australian people will be the cornerstone of my approach in government, while implementing a policy platform with fairness and understanding. Now, in addition to the usual political honeymoon that follows an election, the Australian people, I think, were inclined to grant the Howard government considerable latitude. There would inevitably be mistakes arising from the inexperience of some of those who led it, as very few of the coalition frontbench had any ministerial experience. In fact, apart from the new Prime Minister, who had served as Minister for Business and Consumer Affairs between 1995 and 1997, and then Federal Treasurer from 1997 to 1983, the most experienced cabinet ministers were the Industry Minister John Moore, who'd also been Minister for Business and Consumer Affairs in the Fraser government, and the Finance Minister John Fahey, the former New South Wales Premier. Now, from my discussions with a number of Liberal and National former ministers and party officials, the Coalition's leadership believed privately that the extent of its parliamentary majority in 1996 would probably sustain at least 2 terms in office before the Labor opposition would be organisationally ready for office and electorally competitive. And I say this because none of the prominent commentators predicted on the 2nd of March 1996 that the Howard-led coalition would possibly be a one-term government. And so the coalition entered office with confidence, and it was entitled to believe it would have nearer to 6 years than 3 to implement its agenda. Now, although it announced few policies prior to the poll in an effort to keep the electorate's attention focused on the Keating government's record and the Prime Minister's personal unpopularity, the coalition was nonetheless clear about what it wanted to do. A National Commission of Audit, led by Bob Officer, was ordered to examine Commonwealth expenditure alongside a review of the financial system conducted by Stan Wallace. And having been advised early by Treasury of a $7.6 billion budget deficit, there were reductions in federal spending with a total of $8 billion saved across the first 2 budgets. There were increases in university fees, contractions in the public service, the Commonwealth Employment Service was privatised, and the work for the dole scheme was introduced. The Reserve Bank was made independent of the government by the Statement on the Conduct of Monetary Policy, which was issued on the 14th of August 1996, and a Charter of Budget Honesty Bill was introduced into Parliament on the 11th of December 1996, but not actually passed until 1998. The Workplace Relations Act of 1996 passed through the Senate, but only after the government agreed to 171 changes sought by the Australian Democrats in order to secure its passage through Parliament. The government announced the Defence Efficiency Review in October of 1996 after sparing the Australian Defence Force from severe budget cuts. Foreign affairs, most people thought, were managed well. There were improving relations with Malaysia and the beginning of a new dialogue with Indonesia, even as East Timor remained a difficulty for both nations. In the international portfolios, defence, trade, foreign affairs, the coalition's performance was competent and mostly free from strong parliamentary or press criticism. But unplanned during 1996 was the need to negotiate uniform national firearms legislation in the wake of the Port Arthur massacre, for which the government achieved almost universal praise. There were also the first in a series of ministerial reshuffles arising from breaches of the Guide on Key Elements of Ministerial Conduct, introduced shortly after the coalition took office. The High Court's Wick decision in December of 1996 led to the government's 10-point plan, which was heavily criticised both for delays in its drafting and deficiencies in its content. The Prime Minister himself was chastised for not immediately condemning Hansonism and for failing to neutralise the electoral appeal of the One Nation Party. I gather that's a work in progress. It was said, though, at the time that a parliamentary joint motion opposing racism and affirming a non-discriminatory immigration policy, which was debated in October of 1996, was perhaps too little, too late. So the second year, well, it looked promising for the coalition. Despite the ministerial resignations of the first year, the coalition still presented a united front and a competent front bench that was enjoying a a high degree of collegial solidarity from the backbench. But there was the first mention of a leadership transition on the first anniversary of the Coalition's election victory. The Prime Minister mentioned a 10-year leadership transition, explaining that, and I have to quote, "While my health lasts and I've got my marbles and I'm delivering good leadership and policy success, you stay. But when that changes, you don't." But with the government's popularity declining, the Prime Minister defended his leadership by explaining that we are living at the moment in a time of tremendous change and upheaval. And when someone comes along and offers simplistic solutions and a few scapegoats thrown in for good measure, well, it's easy to cream 6 or 8 or 10 points in an opinion poll mid-term. Well, commentators offered mixed assessments of the first year of coalition rule. There were no indicators in January of 1997 that its performance in the coming year would be considered, even by its supporters, as being less than satisfactory. Indeed, when I said to a Howard government senior minister that the performance in 1997 was less than satisfactory, he said, "You're wrong, it was awful." That was his judgment of that year. Now, he could say that because it improved, but he thought of the 11 years, 8 months and 21 days of the Howard government, perhaps 1997 was the least among them. But there were promises of an improved performance in 1998. The first 6 months were better. The Prime Minister called an election early in August. And the question was asked, would the campaign focus on achievements or on aspirations, on what the Coalition had done or on what it might do? Well, to answer these questions, I'm pleased to introduce our first presenter, Emeritus Professor Murray Goot. An outline of his very distinguished academic career can be found in the conference booklet, as Andrew has mentioned. He will examine the 1998 election campaign and interpret its result.